The Rules Committee will come to order. Our country has made great strides towards equality for members of the LGBTQ plus community. Despite these gains, however, it is still legal to discriminate in areas like employment, housing, and public accommodations in most states today. Our civil rights laws protect Americans on the basis of things like race, sex, disability, and religion, but not sexual orientation or gender identity. It is beyond time for that to change. That's why we are considering Hr5 today. The Equality Act will amend our existing civil rights laws to extend the same protections to LGBTQ plus Americans. And it does so in a way that balances religious freedom. The House passed a similar bill last Congress with a bipartisan vote. What's different this time is that we now have a Democratic Senate and a Democratic president who has pledged to sign this bill if it reaches his desk. The Equality Act was first developed roughly 50 years ago. We should seize this moment and finally make it a reality. We should not let a patchwork of state laws allow people to be discriminated against because of who they are and who they love. We are also acting today to fight climate change and to protect our public lands. Hr803, the Protecting America's Wilderness Act, will designate 1.5 million acres of land as wilderness or potential wilderness. It is a win-win. This bill will help us protect our climate by taking these areas off the table for development and taking excess carbon out of our atmosphere. And it will protect drinking water, preserve natural habitats, and bolster recreation economies, ensuring these pristine areas can be enjoyed for future generations. Now let me turn to our ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we have two items on our agenda today. The first I'll discuss is H.R. 803, the Protecting America's Wilderness and Public Lands Act. The bill is a collection of 8 underlying bills, all referred to the Natural Resources Committee, that all designate specified tracts of land for protection as part of the National Wilderness Preservation System. It also includes one measure that eliminates oil and gas exploration on certain lands in Arizona near the Grand Canyon. While I think all members of Congress, including Republicans, would agree that protecting public lands is an important goal, I have some real concerns about this package. First and foremost, this is a partisan package. Not a single Republican has signed on to any of the underlying bills as a co-sponsor, and some of the lands designated for protection under the bill are in congressional districts where the local member of Congress does not even support this action. That alone is an inauspicious start for this package. Second, I think we need to be clear about what will be the impact of this bill. While shifting lands to the National Wilderness Preservation System for protection may sound good to the casual observer, there are significant consequences that come with doing so. The lands in question are removed from economic development, which undoubtedly will have a negative impact on the economic base of the area in which the lands are located. Moving lands into the National Wilderness Preservation System also has the impact of removing them from use for motorized recreation, which will further harm economic development. Similarly, the section of the bill removing the lands from availability for mining can also be expected to drive down the economic base of the region. This bill is a recipe for putting additional economic pressure on rural areas that are already suffering under the weight of the pandemic. Third, Republicans on the Natural Resources Committee have expressed concerns that the majority is not taking into account fire prevention plans and policies, which have not yet been updated to account for the new additions to the National Wilderness Preservation System. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on these concerns. Our second item is Hr5 the Equality Act. This is a complicated and complex piece of legislation that would make sweeping changes in our nation's civil rights laws if enacted. As the first matter of concern, I note that this bill is coming to the Rules Committee absent a markup in the Judiciary Committee, the Committee of Jurisdiction. Indeed, this bill was only introduced last Thursday and had no committee action prior to its consideration here today in Rules. However, my concern here is not the violation of the so-called McGovern rule, requiring all bills coming before Rules to have had a hearing and markup in the Committee of Jurisdiction. Rather, this bill is an illustration of why the McGovern rule is a good guide for us to follow. regardless of whether or not it is required. H.R. 5 is a deeply complicated bill that will make serious changes to American civil rights law. On a matter this complex that touches all Americans and will make such sweeping changes in our laws, do we not owe it to ourselves, to the institution, the American people, to take the time to actually consider this? Are we not best served on something this important to take the time to let members do their due diligence, make sure that their constituents understand the implications, examine it in committee, and ensure it gets all the debate time needed so that all sides are heard and all ideas are considered? The failure to do so here is simply astonishing to me. That failure is most evident when one considers the real lack of information about how this bill will work in practice. Much that is in this bill is well intentioned, but I share the concerns of my Republican colleagues who believe that parts of this bill may ultimately be unworkable. For example, the bill includes the term, quote, gender identity, unquote, a term that has such a vague definition that even proponents of the bill do not agree on exactly what the term means. And I could say the same for the wholesale changes this bill will require for women's athletics, for domestic violence shelters, and for any other location traditionally segregated according to sex. When making changes to our civil rights laws, important as they are to our nation, we need to be very clear about what the law means and how it is to be applied. Failing to do so will prevent Americans from knowing what exactly Congress intends, which is a recipe for disaster in enforcing the law. While I respect the author and the work he's done, I do not believe this bill, as written, is clear enough to handle the myriad of difficult situations that will inevitably arise from its application. The solution to that problem is clear enough. Since members of the Judiciary Committee did not have the opportunity to amend the bill to make it better and clearer, then I believe the House must have the opportunity to amend the bill on the floor. I believe this committee should make as many amendments in order as possible to ensure that all sides are heard and debated on the floor. At the very least, providing for a rule that meets that goal will ensure that all members will have had a chance to consider this bill, to propose new ideas, and to ensure that each side receives fair and open consideration. Since H.R. 5 is about fairness and equality, we should ask nothing less of ourselves than we are asking of the American people. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman yields back. Just for the record, I want to point out that in the 116th Congress, the Judiciary Committee held a hearing on the Equality Act on April 2nd, 2019. The committee marked up the nearly identical bill, also numbered H.R. 5, on May 1st, and ordered it reported by a party line vote of 22 to 10. The House then passed H.R. 5 by a bipartisan vote of 235 to 173, with 8 Republicans voting in favor. The Senate did not take this up. And while I appreciate the invocation of the McGovern rule, I should point out that the McGovern rule doesn't take effect until April 1st, as specified in our House rules. So in any event, I'm
But
not.
Mr. Chairman, it's such a great idea. I don't think we should wait that long.
Yeah, I know. Well, we gotta follow the rules, right? So.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman.
In any event, I am delighted to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on H.R. 5, the Equality Act. Subcommittee Chairman Cicilline and Ranking Member Jordan, we're delighted that you are here. Without objection, any written materials you submit to rules documents at mail.house.gov before the conclusion of this hearing will be entered into the record. At this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole, for inviting me to testify regarding H.R. 5, the Equality Act. This is the same bill with updated findings that the House passed in the 116th Congress with a bipartisan vote, as Chairman McGovern just mentioned. This long overdue legislation would explicitly outlaw discrimination against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Americans and strengthen non-discrimination protections for women and people of color. As a nation, we endeavor to embody fairness for all Americans. Sometimes we stumble, but we struggle onward. This is an opportunity to take a strong step forward and enshrine equal protection under the law for the LGBTQ community. It's time for us to declare our support for equal rights for all people. When the Declaration of Independence was written and the powerful words, "all men are created equal," were included in it, The phrase did not include men of color, Native Americans, or women. It most definitely did not include LGBTQ individuals. As we have done at intervals throughout our history, we have realized as a nation that the definition must be expanded. This is one of those moments. I'm grateful that the American people and the public already has a profound understanding of the need for equal protection for LGBTQ individuals. Polls consistently find Americans support LGBT non-discrimination laws. A 2020 Public Religion Research Institute poll found that 83% of Americans favor laws that would protect gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people against discrimination in jobs, public accommodations, and housing, compared to only 16% of Americans who oppose such laws. It's Republicans, Democrats, and independents. Majorities of Republicans, Democrats, and independents favor non-discrimination laws that protect the LGBTQ community. Similarly, a truly outstanding group of businesses and other organizations support the Equality Act, including Kellogg, Chevron, Hershey, Toyota, just to name a few, the AFL-CIO, the National PTA, the National Association of Manufacturers, the United States Chamber of Commerce, the ACLU, and everyone in between. All believe the Equality Act should become the law of the land. The Equality Act would expand protection against discrimination for LGBTQ Americans by amending the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Fair Housing Act, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, the Jury Selection and Services Act, and several other laws that govern Congress. And so again, it's taking the existing civil rights architecture and adding two protected classes for individuals prohibiting discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. The bill also expands the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to clarify the definition of a public accommodation so that a broader range of businesses are covered, such as retail stores and hospitals. This ensures that everyone protected by the Act receives those enhanced protections. In more simple terms, here's what the Equality Act does. It ensures that a child of LGBTQ parents will not be turned away from their pediatrician's office. It ensures that a transgender teenager can attend school without fear for their safety. It ensures that an LGBTQ employee can't get married on Saturday, post pictures on social media on Sunday, and get fired from their job on Monday. Sadly, in many states where there are protections for LGBTQ civil rights, many states, protections don't exist. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people face discrimination in housing, while shopping, and in so many other parts of life. I believe that most Americans would be shocked to know that this is the case. Many Americans wrongly assume that LGBTQ Americans already have protection under the law. They find it inconceivable that this group of millions of Americans would remain unprotected, and this is our chance to update the law to ensure equal protection for all. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is one of our nation's greatest legislative achievements. It's central to guaranteeing some of our most fundamental rights. Indeed, one could say it's almost sacrosanct. While Hr5 expands non-discrimination protections in the 1964 Act and other statutes, it was also drafted with great sensitivity so as not to erode the existing provisions of these statutes. In light of this, the committee should be mindful that even seemingly minor changes to the 1964 Act and other core civil rights statutes beyond those provided for in Hr5 can have significant and possibly unforeseen negative ramifications that may undermine existing protections and echo through American society for decades. Therefore, I urge this committee to resist attempts to use this bill to erode current law. As the first openly gay mayor of an American capital city, I've seen firsthand the struggles that many in my community have faced achieving the American dream. The right to live freely without fear of persecution or discrimination is one many in the LGBTQ community felt was an impossibility for so long. I thank the committee for the opportunity to testify about the Equality Act, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I now yield to Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me associate myself with the ranking member's comments. I just want to make maybe point out two big concerns that I have with the legislation. First, the bill is the result of a very rushed process. In fact, no process whatsoever. It should have gone through the normal legislative process, the normal regular order, as we like to say around Congress. Unfortunately, it didn't. Under House rule, that's supposed to mean at least one hearing and a committee markup. And as has been discussed, this bill had neither. The chairman pointed out that this bill was in front of the committee with a markup and vote last Congress, but I think it's important to understand we got 60 new members of Congress and 11 new members on the Judiciary Committee. These members have not had an opportunity to have the thorough discussion that takes place in committee and happens over several weeks of debate in the United States Congress. And I think that is a large part of the reason for the problems with the legislation. Second, and most importantly, the legislation guts the religious freedom protections outlined in the Bipartisan Religious Freedom Restoration Act and, frankly, the Constitution of the United States. The bill undermines America's religious liberty rights. I think it's important to understand the very first right, and I know this committee knows this, members of Congress know this, the American people know this. The first right in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights is your right to practice your faith in the way you think the good Lord wants you to do so. The framers understood the importance of freedom of religion. When the RFRA Act was passed in 1993, Chairman Nadler understood it too. In fact, here's what he had to say during that debate. What has made the American experiment work has been a tolerance and a respect for the diversity enshrined in the freedom of religion clauses of our Bill of Rights. It was no accident that the framers of our Bill of Rights chose to place the free exercise of religion first among our fundamental freedoms. This House should do no less. I couldn't agree more. Without the protections of RFRA, houses of worship and religiously affiliated schools, hospitals, nonprofits, and other entities will be forced to act contrary to their beliefs or to stop offering certain services to the public, certain services they may have offered for years and decades. This bill offers no protection for doctors who decline to perform abortions due to sincerely held religious, moral, or ethical beliefs, and it would also undermine existing prohibitions on the use of taxpayer funds for abortion services. Americans would no longer would be free to live, work, and serve in their communities in a way that is consistent with their faith. That is why I think this bill has serious problems, and I oppose it and hope, as the ranking member indicated, Mr. Chairman, that the committee will see fit to allow amendments to be offered on the floor where we can have a real debate about the concerns that the ranking member raised, that I raised, and the folks who will present their amendments will raise in a few minutes. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I feel very strongly that we ought to move forward on this bill, and I think it's the right thing to do, and it's long overdue. So I have no questions. I will yield to Mr. Cole for any questions he may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of questions for Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan, I'd like to discuss, and you touched on this in your testimony, how drastically this bill alters religious freedom beyond the cases related to the LGBTQ community. Hr5 forbids raising the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, a bipartisan law preserving and protecting religious freedom in this country, as a claim or defense to the application of the Equity Act. This prohibition applies to every federal law amended by Hr5. Is that correct?
Right. You can't, I appreciate the question from the ranking member. You can't raise the very first right mentioned in the very first amendment to the Bill of Rights as part of the United States Constitution. You can't raise that. That is our fundamental concern with the legislation. And again, if we'd have had, I think, the process that we normally have around here, maybe we could have worked on this, dealt with this, and addressed this issue. But I think that's the number one concern that folks on our side of the aisle have problems with.
Let me build on that a little bit. And like you, I find this a very troubling aspect of the legislation. Civil Rights Act of 1964 permits houses of worship to make employment decisions based on religion. So if the Equality Act were enacted, could a Catholic or Protestant church be forced to hire somebody outside their faith or somebody outside any faith, an atheist, for instance?
Yeah, that is the very real concern that we have. And you know, again, we're talking about fundamental liberties here, fundamental freedoms here, as I've said now a couple times, as I think you indicated in your opening statements, Mr. Cole. We're talking about, as Mr. Nadler indicated in his statement with the RFRA Act back in the mid-90s. We're talking about the very first liberty mentioned in the very first one the founders talked about in the First Amendment. And so, yeah, and what does this mean for the people? Particularly, you're thinking about Catholic services or these non-for-profits, the people they serve in many times disadvantaged communities. What does it mean for the kind of service they then provide these people? Are they going to have to stop because of this sincerely held religious belief? That is a real question, a real concern, and something that I think is very troubling with this legislation.
Well, to my friends on the other side of the aisle, even the Affordable Care Act contained conscience or refusal provisions for religious persons, and that is a very great concern to me because, again, the Equality Act expressly denies those kinds of exceptions. So we are breaking new ground here, and I think it would have been worth having a robust discussion about this at the committee level, and hopefully we certainly can have that on the floor and the appropriate votes. One last question, if I may, Mr. Jordan. I was a co-sponsor and strong supporter of the Pregnancy Non-Discrimination Act and voted for it on the House floor last Congress. Make no mistake, I believe it's a policy area deserving of Congress's attention and action. However, I'm concerned that under the guise of preventing pregnancy discrimination, the Equality Act essentially creates a national policy of abortion on demand for any or no reason, and that this bill would prevent, for example, faith-based hospitals from declining to provide abortions on demand. Are my concerns well-founded?
They sure are, and it's why I raised it in my opening comments. Again, I think just underscoring our concerns with the legislation. No one wants discrimination of any sort, any form, but we also need to respect people's religious beliefs, as the founders understood well. So, yeah, I think that's a valid concern, and that's why you raised it, it's why I raised it, and why we should have more debate on this legislation before proceeding further. Or, as you indicated, Mr. Ranking Member, allowing amendments to be offered. I'm not sure what all amendments are there, but I know there are several being offered from the Republican side.
Well, we certainly going to offer an opportunity to have, for instance, an open rule on this so that all members, because this is an important piece of legislation, could come to the floor. Because again, we were denied a committee process here where that could have been taken care of at that level. But anyway, thank you very much for your testimony. Thank my friend from Rhode Island for his testimony as well. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Yeah, thank you very much. I probably should at this point see whether Mr. Cicilline has any response to any of these issues.
Oh, absolutely, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut off my friend.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, for your kind words.
And I say that because listening to the exchange, it is frustrating. Mr. Jordan says that nobody favors or wants discrimination, yet for too long it's been tolerated and it's been sanctioned. And this is an attempt to put it to an end once and for all. So, Mr. Cicilline, if you have anything you want to add.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to put a finer point on that, 2/3 of LGBTQ Americans report experiencing discrimination in one of the forms I've described. So this is a real issue in this country. But let me put to rest this notion that the Equality Act in any way disturbs existing religious exemptions. The Equality Act simply says whatever religious exemptions exist, they remain in place with respect to the LGBTQ community. We're not looking for more protections. We're not looking for less. We're asking that the religious exemptions apply in the same way. And so to answer the question very directly that Mr. Cole raises, religious organizations, not just houses of worship, are free to limit participation in a wide array of activities and services to only members of their faith, period. That remains unchanged by the Equality Act. Similarly, no member of the clergy, no religious institution will be forced to perform a ceremony that's contrary to their religious beliefs. So all those exemptions for ministerial functions, efforts to limit services to your own congregation, to people of your own faith, as determined by you. So you could have a Catholic church say, we're going to have a food pantry only for people in our church, only for Catholics. And they get to decide who's a Catholic in good standing, and they get to decide who to exclude. All of those religious exemptions exist today. They will exist after the passage of the Equality Act. It does nothing to change that. With respect to the abortion question, it is absolutely not the case that anyone will be compelled to perform medical services they don't currently perform. All this Equality Act says is if you perform a medical service and you currently do that, you just can't deny it to someone based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. You're not required to perform anything you don't currently do. So let me reassure you that the religious exemptions that exist will apply the same way. They have been well developed. We are not asking for greater religious exemptions. We're not asking for less. We're asking that they be applied the same way, and it strikes a balance. And the reason RFRA makes no sense in this context is because RFRA was created to protect religious minorities. And the purpose of it was to say, before you can have any infringement on religious exercise, there has to be a compelling state interest. We already know as a matter of law and policy that ending discrimination is a compelling state interest. That's the whole purpose of the civil rights law. And so it just simply says, since the Equality Act is about promoting equality and preventing discrimination, we don't need to worry about, is there a compelling interest? That is the compelling interest, and it doesn't make sense to invoke RFRA. So again, religious exemptions remain intact to the same extent they've always existed. The Equality Act doesn't change that. And we, I think, balance always in the civil rights area two competing interests. One, to protect religious freedom, and the other to protect a very strong interest in ending discrimination. We strike that balance in the same way we do in all the other areas of the civil rights law.
Thank you very much. Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I am a proud co-sponsor of this legislation. You know, I'm so happy to be on the Rules Committee to talk about fundamental rights, human rights. In the past decade, America has made some progress toward securing fundamental rights for the LGBTQ+ community. Last year, the Supreme Court ruled that gay and transgender employees are protected from discrimination based on their gender identity and sexual orientation. That's at work. Since becoming president in January, President Biden has made enormous strides toward implementing policies that protect LGBTQ rights, including signing executive orders to allow transgender soldiers to serve, mandating housing and workplace protections for LGBTQ individuals, and standing up for equality across the globe. However, we cannot rely on a president or on an executive order to guarantee protections for LGBTQ+ individuals. The queer and transgender community spent the last 4 years facing assault after assault on their basic human rights, from housing to healthcare, leaving many LGBTQ people wondering if these rights are guaranteed for the moment, under this administration, and what about the next administration? What would they bring? Presently, 11 million LGBTQ+ Americans live in a constant state of instability. By failing to provide a stable legal doctrine, we keep them marginalized. I don't think that that is the purpose of Congress. Last week, February 18th, China Creel, a 25-year-old transgender woman, was murdered. She is the 7th transgender person to be murdered in just 6 weeks into the new year. Discrimination and bullying from a young age led 40% of LGBTQ youth to seriously consider suicide in the past year. It's time we say enough. And as Congress, we must send a message that it is unacceptable, and that we must guarantee LGBTQ constituents their fundamental rights. In America, 29 states do not have comprehensive laws prohibiting discrimination for LGBTQ+ people, which is why we need action at the federal level now. The Equality Act will codify in law these basic protections, and I urge my colleagues to stand with our LGBTQ constituents and pass this legislation. Mr. Chairman, I have no questions, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Burgess. Okay, let me go to Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Ranking Member Jordan, I have a question for you. I was just curious how the Equality Act will impact Title IX, which, as you know, ensures women have the same opportunities as men in sports. So with that, Ranking Member Jordan, I yield to you.
Well, I appreciate the gentleman's question. I think it's fairly obvious if someone who's I think it undermines Title IX, frankly. I mean, Title IX, we have 4 children, two daughters, and both were athletes. I think it undermines their ability to, that undermines the intent of Title IX. We've all now seen examples where you have an individual who biologically is male competing against females, and we see the results. So I think it's a problem, and then you don't have to take my word for it. There have been all kinds of amazing female athletes, typically on the political spectrum on the left, who have said who've raised some of the same concerns. So that is a concern. I think lots of parents, lots of moms and dads out there would be nervous about this and the impact it may have on their daughter, particularly a daughter who is pretty darn good athlete and looking for opportunities to compete at the next level at the university and collegiate level. So I think that's a concern as well. I think the biggest concern is a religious liberty issue, but I think this is a valid concern that people have, and I think it's warranted.
Thank you, Ranking Member Jordan. And with that, I yield back to the chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think Mr. Cicilline did a very good job responding to the concerns that were raised by Mr. Jordan. I'm a co-sponsor of this bill. This kind of discrimination has to end. And, you know, I mean, sometimes particular rights kind of bump into each other, but it starts with equality, starts with no discrimination from my point of view. And I appreciate Mr. Cicilline and his advocacy on this particular piece of legislation. I yield back.
Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If this becomes law, Americans can expect government-imposed limitations on the free exercise of religious liberty, businesses forced to cover the cost of abortions, and medical providers required to perform abortion, even if it is in conflict with their deeply held beliefs. Unfortunately, that is just the tip of the iceberg. So today, I speak on behalf of the pro-life Americans in my district and across the country who fear this legislation will be manipulated by the radical left to impose its will and create a legal right to an abortion right up to the moment of birth. A majority of Americans support at least some restrictions on abortion, including making sure taxpayer funds are not used to fund abortions. Instead of respecting all the rights of all Americans, this bill will impose a top-down abortion mandate that interferes with state and federal laws that protect the right to life and will force doctors, nurses, and other medical providers to participate in abortion procedures, even if it goes against their beliefs. As a Minnesotan, as an American, as a woman of faith, and as a mother and a grandmother, the issue of life is personal to me. Life is precious from conception until natural death. And I would like to ask Ranking Member Jordan, can you expound a bit on how the Equality Act allows for increased abortion through possibly the adoption of the definition of sex?
Yeah, well, I appreciate the gentlelady's comments and question. Let me just go to this fundamental issue about the RFRA. I mean, if you look at the legislation, page 25 of the legislation, it stipulates that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act cannot be used as a defense to any claim under the legislation. So that's our concern. And frankly, I mean, this would be something that I think would have had serious debate if we'd have had a markup in the committee and had the debate that you typically have with legislation, especially with 60 new members of this Congress, 11 new members on the Judiciary Committee. That is the concern when it comes to protecting the sanctity of human life, when it comes to religious groups affiliated with the church, affiliated with the religious group, nonprofits affiliated with the religious entity. That is the concern, because the legislation itself specifically prohibits using the Religious Freedom Restoration Act as a defense against what it's attempting to do. And because of that, without this protection, houses of worship, religiously affiliated schools, hospitals, nonprofits, and other entities will be forced to act contrary to their belief. And this is where it would impact that doctor at a Catholic hospital who understands that doesn't want to take the life of an unborn child. That is the concern that I think the gentlelady understands, and why you asked the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Yeah, thank you. Before I yield to Mr. Raskin, I want to give Mr. Cicilline an opportunity to respond. because I have to tell you that one of the things that's really frustrating me about this debate by some of the opponents is that there's no outrage over the discrimination, no outrage over the bigotry that the LGBTQ plus community has to face every day in so many states across this country. I mean, it's blatant discrimination, and I'm puzzled why this is such a controversial issue, but nonetheless, it seems to be, and we're talking about things that I'm not sure have any direct relationship to what this bill does. But Mr. Cicilline, why don't you respond to the issue of the sports and abortion and all the other stuff?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me be very clear. This bill has nothing to do with abortion. It doesn't change any laws about abortion. It doesn't have the potential to change, no matter how much some people might be worried about it. It simply doesn't do it. And so it doesn't require specific healthcare services to be provided. It doesn't create any right to an abortion. It doesn't create a right to abortion on demand. That simply is not in the bill. This is a bill that prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in several areas of life, period. No more, no less. Second issue on women in sports. Let's be very clear. This notion that somehow transgender women are entering sports and winning at a higher rate than cis women or women that are born women is simply, there's just no evidence of that. It doesn't exist. It's not a real issue. There's no evidence that people are transitioning to become a woman in order to win a trophy or win a competition. It's just not the case. That's number one. Number two, Title IX remains intact. There are no changes to Title IX. Title IX already protects the right of cis women to participate in sports and to be treated fairly. The Equality Act says the same protections exist for transgender women, and you have to figure out how to respect the rights of both of those groups, period. And Title IX is unchanged. If people feel they've been aggrieved in some way, treated unfairly as a result of the participation of trans women, they have a cause of action under Title IX. And so that remains completely unchanged. And finally, I don't know how forcefully I can say this, the religious exemptions that is causing people to kind of worry about simply remain intact. The Equality Act doesn't change those religious exemptions. So again, I'll repeat it. If you run a food pantry at a Catholic church and you want it to be only for members of your church or your congregation, you can do so. You can exclude people. You can say, we only want Catholics to come and get food, and we will decide as a faith community who is a Catholic in good standing. And so you can exclude members of the LGBTQ community. That's the religious exemption that currently exists. It remains intact. The Equality Act doesn't change it in any way. So with all due respect, the notion that people are just troubled by stuff kind of in the abstract, the bill answers your questions and should reassure you religious protections are intact. Abortion has nothing to do with the bill, and transgender women have been and will continue to be able to participate in sports, but treated fairly. And I thank you for the opportunity to respond.
Thank you. Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. And Mr. Cicilline, thank you very much for your lucid testimony here. Just to be clear about this, as I understand it, there are 29 states that have adopted civil rights legislation protecting the LGBTQ community against discrimination. Has this law in the states ever led to abortion on demand in the 9th month, as was suggested by one of the members before?
No, nor has it even led to my knowledge, a claim that somehow created a right to abortion.
It just has nothing to do with it. It's a completely irrelevant distraction. What we have before us is civil rights legislation about protecting the rights of the LGBTQ community to be treated equally in all aspects of life. And as you suggest, most people think that's the case, but that's because it exists in most states, but it doesn't exist in every state. And the way that civil rights legislation has always worked is that it bubbles up from the states and there's a movement in the states, and then finally Congress catches up with the people and says this is something that we should be doing nationally. What's interesting about that process is that religious free exercise arguments have been mobilized always against civil rights progress every step along the way, whether you're talking about race or gender or sexual orientation. If you go back and you look in 1964, the Supreme Court decisions, Ali's Barbecue case, any of the cases dealing with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, people were making religious free exercise arguments. No, we don't want to serve you in our lunch counter. We don't want to serve you in our drugstore. We don't want to serve you in our restaurant because we have a religious objection to either, white establishments serving African-American customers or mixed groups coming in. It violates our religious freedoms. And at every point, the Supreme Court has said that the rights of the people to participate in civil life and in commerce override anybody's asserted religious free exercise objection to discriminate against other people. And, even when women got the right to vote, people were saying this violates the biblical command that women must remain in the home and can't have the right to vote. And we overrode that with the 19th Amendment. So I'm glad that you clarified this doesn't change any church or religious establishment's rights under the law today in any way at all. But I do recommend to my friends who are asserting that there's somehow a religious free exercise right to discriminate or a religious free exercise right to override general secular laws of universal significance to check out the work of none other than Justice Scalia in Employment Division versus Smith in 1990, where he completely blew away this argument. And in that case, what you had was members of the Native American religion who were asserting that they had a right to use peyote because it was a sincere and integral part of their religious practice without any adverse secular consequences by the government. And Scalia said, no, if you've got a universal law that applies to everybody and it's not adopted for the purposes of persecuting anybody because of their religion, then everybody's got to accept it. And they cited cases dealing with child labor, where a lot of religious groups or cults were saying we have the right to use our children to go out and pass out our literature 12 hours a day. That's part of a religious practice. And the Supreme Court said, no, the child labor laws apply to you. So I'm afraid that Justice Scalia, in his wisdom, has rejected categorically the arguments that were being made by some of our colleagues before. In any event, your legislative program specifically allows any religious freedom that exists right now to continue to exist, and nobody is compelled to engage in any medical practice against their will, much less abortion, which just has nothing to do with it. So this is civil rights legislation. I'm glad that we are clarifying that it's civil rights legislation. It's going to apply to millions of people. This should be a day of great pride for all Americans who believe in the equality of all Americans. This is what it means to be an American, to accept other people's equal rights in public places. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you so much, Chairman. I hate following Mr. Raskin because he always says all the right things. So I wholeheartedly endorse his remarks. But look, this is the Equality Act. We are asking to extend the protections of the Civil Rights Act to our LGBTQ community. And that is long, long overdue. There's a very active LGBTQ community in my district. And we've seen great strides in terms of, sharing that pride, sharing equality, but we know we've got so far to go. We've had more murders of transgender women of color in Philadelphia in recent years than it just pains me to think about it. So we have a long way to go. Mr. Cicilline, we've had some suggestions here about the Equality Act somehow preventing girls from being able to participate in sports because of their transgender peers who might also want the opportunity to participate in sports. And as someone who grew up with two sisters and was very glad to see Title IX come into effect and have the opportunity to participate, I know that we still have not advanced the cause of girls in sports enough, and we still have a ways to go there. But I don't think that we advance equality for everyone by bullying our transgender children who might want to participate. Can you tell us anything about this argument that somehow the Equality Act is going to deny girls the opportunity to participate in sports?
Yes, thank you for your question. There are many threats to women and girls in sports, including inadequate funding in women's sports programs, sexual assault and harassment, inadequate investment in women coaches and women in leadership positions, and lack of equal pay in professional sports. The presence of women and girls who are trans is not one of those threats, however. There's just no evidence that trans women are winning competitive sports at a higher rate of success than cis women. There's just no evidence. There's been no claim of that. In fact, no trans woman has ever qualified for the Olympics despite being eligible to compete in the women's Olympic category at least since 1994. So there are only a handful of women and girl athletes who are trans who have had any success in the US at the high school and collegiate level, despite hundreds, if not thousands, of trans women and girls who are competing. So this is a solution in search of a problem. It just doesn't exist. That's number one. Number two, Title IX that you referenced remains fully intact, which provides a whole array of remedies for women who feel they've been treated somehow unfairly or denied equal access in athletics, and it's worked successfully. It remains untouched by the Equality Act. All the Equality Act says those rights that give women, cis women, the right to participate and be treated fairly also apply to trans women and give them equal protection under the law. And that's why many major sports organizations, including the Women's Sports Foundation, the National Women's Law Center, and a number of other women's sports organizations, the Women Leaders in Collegiate Sports, the American Association of University Women, the Women's Sports Foundation, and the National Women's Law Center all endorse and support passage of the Equality Act. So it will not in any way interfere with the right of women to participate in sports, and it will only strengthen the ability of trans women to participate as well and protect them from discrimination.
Thank you. And I would note, I guess, you know, as in some of the other civil rights laws that I think Representative Raskin mentioned, that these things bubble up through the states. I would note that 20 states already allow transgender children to participate in sports based on their gender identity. And we haven't seen the kind of, you know, upending of girls' sports that has been suggested here today. With that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for bringing up this important bill. I see this essentially evolving a vital basic human right. I'm a proud co-sponsor of the bill, and I think as it relates to the First Amendment, in this act, Congress is not making a law which would establish a religion, nor is it prohibit the free exercise thereof. And I would associate myself with the remarks made by my colleagues who are far more eloquent on the subject, and appreciate everything they've said. And with that, I will support the resolution, the rule, the underlying resolution. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Ross.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much to Congressman Cicilline for bringing this Equality Act forward. It is long overdue. What we have seen is that the people, the Supreme Court, and our businesses are far ahead of this Congress and many states in recognizing the dignity and equality of all people. I'm from a state that desperately needs the Equality Act because in recent years, we've had laws passed taking away the rights of LGBTQ people. And not only has that been an offense, an indignity, but it has hurt the entire state of North Carolina. We recently had a law that was passed after a local government tried to extend more rights to LGBTQ folks, and the legislature punished the entire state by outlawing doing that. And the result was nothing short of economic catastrophe for the state of North Carolina. We have seen with the people who have signed on to this and are supporting it, it is bipartisan. We have chambers of commerce who are in favor of it. It is, as we know, simply the right thing to do. And the state of North Carolina needs a national law to protect our people. Thank you so much for bringing this forward. I am a proud co-sponsor. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question? Seeing none, I would like to thank our witnesses, Mr. Cicilline and Mr. Jordan, for their testimony. You are now excused.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. This closes the hearing on H.R. 5. I would now like to call up our next panel to testify on H.R. 803, the Protecting America's Wilderness and Public Lands Act. Representative DeGette and Ranking Member Westerman, we're delighted that you are here. Without any objection, any written materials you submit to rules documents at mail.house.gov before the conclusion of this hearing will be entered into the record. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. DeGette.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and also Ranking Member Cole, members of the Rules Committee. I want to thank you for considering today H.R. 803, which is the Protecting America's Wilderness and Public Lands Act. The Rules Committee print for H.R. 803 combines 8 previously standalone proposals, which will protect and conserve America's public lands, promote outdoor recreation, and help us as a country prepare for the impacts of climate change. Each one of these bills has passed the House in the last Congress with bipartisan votes of support, either individually or in combination. Title I of the rules print includes my bill, the Colorado Wilderness Act, which I'll talk about briefly in a moment. Title II includes the Northwest California Wilderness, Recreation, and Working Forest Act, introduced by my Natural Resources Committee colleague, Representative Jared Huffman. Title III is Congressman Derek Kilmer's Wild Olympics Wilderness and Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Title IV is Representative Salud Carbajal's Central Coast Heritage Protection Act. Title V, the San Gabriel Mountains, Foothills, and Rivers Protection Act, has been brought forward by Representative Judy Chu. Title VI, the Rim of the Valley Corridor Protection Act, is offered by Representative Adam Schiff. Title VII includes the Colorado Outdoor Recreation Economy, or the CORE Act, which is legislation sponsored by my good friend and colleague from Colorado, Representative Joe Neguse. And finally, Title VIII includes the Grand Canyon Protection Act, offered by the chairman of our committee, the House Natural Resources Committee, Representative Grijalva. In total, the Protect America's Wilderness and Public Lands Act would designate nearly 1.5 million acres of public land as new, expanded, or potential wilderness in Colorado, California, and Washington, and also add more than 1,200 miles of rivers to the National Wild and Scenic River System. Another approximately 1.2 million acres of public lands would be withdrawn from new drilling, and mining, ensuring that like iconic landscapes like the Grand Canyon and Colorado's Thompson Divide are permanently protected for future generations to enjoy. In short, it's almost 3 million acres of protection of wildlands in the West. This bill also contains new or expanded recreation areas and national monuments, scenic and special management areas, restoration areas, trails, and other visitor use facilities. All of these designations will also help further environmental justice efforts by improving access to clean water, clean air, and healthy outdoor recreation, while supporting jobs, local economies, and historically underserved communities. Now, each one of these titles has its own merits and diverse coalitions of supporters, but as a whole, the Protecting America's Wilderness and Public Lands Act represents a commitment by this Congress to ensure that public lands are at the forefront of our work to deliver equitable climate solutions for the American people, including protecting 30% of America's lands by 2030. If you may indulge me for a moment, Mr. Chairman, I just want to talk very briefly about the Colorado Wilderness Act, because it's been near and dear to my heart for over 20 years. In my portion of the bill, it's 660,000 acres of Colorado public lands, almost all of which have been designated and managed as wilderness study areas since the mid-1980s, for almost 40 years. Recently in Colorado, a poll showed that 2/3 of the people on the western slope of Colorado, which is where these lands are situated, support increased wilderness. And this bill is a result of many, many years, not just by myself, but by advocates and community activists to make sure that we protect these very, very special areas. We have over 14,000 letters of support from residents. We have support from over 350 businesses. And I'd like to invite everybody on the Rules Committee to come with me next summer when I go on one of my wilderness trips to look and see at these fantastic areas which are so important to preserve for our heritage. Anyway, I just want to say the type of collaboration we had for the Colorado Wilderness Act, it's not unique to my bill. It is endemic in every single one of the pieces of land that are contained in this large omnibus bill. And frankly, by providing lasting protections for large connected landscapes in Colorado, California, Washington, and Arizona, we really make sure to continue our strong public lands legacy and that we pass it on for future generations. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. I'm now happy to yield to the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, and members of the committee. I appreciate you holding this hearing. Wildernesses are something we're all passionate about. The gentlelady made a strong argument for wilderness areas, and I hope to be able to at least present part of the rest of the story about the Protecting America's Wilderness and Public Lands Act. It's an unbalanced partisan package of 8 public land bills that has not gone through regular order and lacks the consensus needed for legislation of this magnitude. The bill creates nearly 1.5 million acres of new wilderness, withdraws 1.2 million acres from mineral production, and designates over 1,200 miles of wild and scenic rivers. To put some of these numbers into perspective and to be able to understand the order of magnitude of these proposals, please consider that the miles of wild and scenic rivers this bill designates are enough that I could drive from my district in Hot Springs, Arkansas, to Times Square in New York. That drive would take over 19 hours at over 60 miles per hour. Additionally, the amount of wilderness designated in this bill is nearly equivalent to the size of President Biden's home state of Delaware, and the bill's mineral withdrawal is significantly larger than the state of Rhode Island. Despite the fact that this bill has huge implications for 4 Western states, this bill has not gone through regular order. In fact, this bill was put on the floor calendar before the Natural Resources Committee had even organized. Some of our freshman members, like Representative Lauren Boebert, have not even been in Congress for 2 months now, and this bill is going to the floor without her consultation, approval, or ability to offer a single amendment in committee. This is particularly egregious because nearly 2/3 of the wilderness designations in Title I of the bill are in her district. Because Republicans on our committee were unable to offer amendments to this bill through a committee markup process, I'm asking the Rules Committee to make as many amendments as possible in order so we can at least have a fraction of the debate that is deserved. Specifically, I think the committee should consider amendments that affect the following 6 areas. The first one is recreation and public access. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Americans have been getting outdoors and enjoying their public lands more than ever. The last thing we should do is restrict existing recreational activities on those lands that people are currently utilizing. Wilderness is the most restrictive federal land designation and doesn't allow for many forms of recreation, including mountain biking and ATV use. Many of the lands designated under this bill include existing motorized and mechanized trails. For example, Title I of the bill designates a potential wilderness area that overlaps with 8 miles of the Tabawatch Trail in Colorado. This trail connects Grand Junction and Montrose and is very popular with mountain bikers and motorized recreationists. Representative Moore of Utah, Representative Calvert, and myself have offered amendments that I hope are made in order that would preserve these existing recreational uses and protect public access to these lands. Number 2 is forest health and wildfire mitigation. 2020 was a historically bad wildfire season that saw millions of acres across the West burn. Wilderness designations severely limit the ability to mechanically treat areas that are overgrown and fire prone, and in the past 10 years, nearly 7 million acres of wilderness and wilderness study areas have burned up in catastrophic wildfires. Alarmingly, this bill also designates lands in the wildland-urban interface that are close to communities and at a high risk for wildfire. Designating these lands as wilderness is a serious threat to life and property in these areas. My amendment number 46, Rosendale amendment number 36, LaMalfa amendment number 64, and Moore amendment number 6 should all be top considerations for the committee as you debate which amendments to make in order. The third is national security. Landborne amendment number 43 would modify a study in the bill that was accepted as an amendment last year to delay any wilderness designations until we can verify these designations do not impact our military readiness. There are serious concerns this bill could impact critically important helicopter training at the Colorado National Guard's high altitude aviation training site. It is common sense that we would wait to designate these lands until we can absolutely be certain there is no national security impact. Number 4 is good governance. Several of the members whose districts are impacted by this bill strongly oppose this legislation and have not been meaningfully consulted on its provisions. Representative Stauber has offered amendment number 11 that would exempt 3 congressional districts that are represented by members who oppose this bill. Because these members have not even been consulted on this package, I would strongly urge this amendment to be made in order. Additionally, I introduced Amendment 45 that would exempt any lands that do not meet the definition of wilderness in the Wilderness Act. Wilderness is supposed to represent lands that are untouched by man, not lands that already have existing infrastructure like roads or trails. Tens of thousands of acres designated under this act were not recommended by the agencies and should be removed from the bill. Am I alone in seeing a problem with designating an area as wilderness that doesn't meet the definition of wilderness? The fifth one is mineral security. Title 8 of this legislative package imposes a 1 million acre mineral withdrawal in Arizona that would put the largest tract of uranium deposits in the country off limits forever. It's estimated there's 326 million pounds of uranium in this area. This action will undoubtedly result in increased imports of uranium from nations that are hostile to the interests of the United States. Gosar Amendment number 29, Burgess number 22, Rosendale number 32, and Hearn number 53 would require the administration to certify that the proposed withdrawals will not negatively impact the national security of the United States by increasing our reliance on nations such as Russia and China for our critical minerals, including uranium. Additionally, Curtis 47 would require the Department of Interior to study the mineral deposits in each of the proposed withdrawal areas to ensure that we are not indefinitely locking up minerals needed for battery storage, renewable energy technology, and electric vehicles. Number 6, and the final issue, is water rights. The Western states are governed by our senior water rights doctrine, usually determined by a state water engineer or board. This doctrine has been in place for over a century and a half in both Democrat and Republican administrations. Yet this bill circumvents state water rights primacy in some cases. My Western colleague from Idaho, Mr. Fulcher, has 2 amendments to protect state water from federal preemption. In addition, Mr. Newhouse has an amendment that protects existing contractual water supplies under this bill. I request that these amendments be made in order. In conclusion, I would like to urge my colleagues to oppose this bill and make the amendments I mentioned earlier in order. Thank you, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. I have no questions. Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that a statement from Representative Calvert concerning this legislation be placed in front of and particularly his amendment, number 63, be placed into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Westman, you went through what I find a very troubling list of members who have areas impacted by this bill who feel like they weren't consulted at all and that their input wasn't sought or certainly heeded. Do you have any sense as to why the committee is continuing this troubling trend? And when I first got here, which granted was long before you did, we really paid a lot of attention to what a local member had to say about his or her district when we were putting lands in trust. We just assumed that they knew the stakeholders, they knew the place, that they had a unique perspective. As a matter of fact, I find it rather odd that we're going to be talking about returning earmarks because we want members to have input on things that are very local where they tend to have knowledge. And it seems to me public lands is very much that sort of an issue. I would expect to know my district and these issues better than most other people. I would expect these members know their districts and their constituencies better. So can you, is there much discussion on that in the Natural Resources Committee and much concern on your part and your fellow members?
Yeah, Ranking Member Cole, I appreciate you highlighting that. You know, I've started legislative service in the state legislature, and you know, one of the I would call it an unspoken rule of decorum is you don't propose legislation that's going to affect somebody else's district without first consulting with those members, because they are the ones who are closest to the people back in their district. They understand the needs, and they're the ones that are going to have to go home and answer to their constituents. So I can imagine what it would be like. Probably will, if we continue down this road, we'll probably experience it someday where somebody else proposes legislation in my district and doesn't seek my input on it. And to me, it's just, you know, ignoring the will of the people when you don't talk to the person who is represented or elected to represent those people. So I have a personal problem with it, and I think all members of Congress should really respect the rights of members to represent their district, and think about how you would feel if you were in these folks' shoes to have something really crammed through without your input on it.
It concerns me. Second question, can you give me an idea what kind of opportunity local officials and stakeholders and groups had to talk about what the impact might be, not just members, but actually people from the affected areas come up and be able to present their views in front of the committee?
Well, as I said, we haven't even had a hearing on these bills during this Congress. There were some hearings in the last Congress on some of these issues. Again, we put 8 bills in one package here. As you can imagine, when you look at 8 bills affecting different parts of the country, there's going to be local stakeholders who have a problem with it. We've got new members of Congress who haven't had a chance to voice their opinions and ideas and objections to these bills. So, you know, not only have we cut members of Congress out of the debate, we've cut local stakeholders out of the debate. It's unfortunate that this bill, this package is going to the floor so quickly. I don't know what the rush is when we couldn't have hearings, invite those stakeholders in, get that input from local communities. But unfortunately, here we are, and we're trying to make the best of it with amendments. But as a whole, the whole process is flawed.
Well, I just want to associate myself with your request that those amendments be made in order. Frankly, since we didn't have a committee process, since members weren't consulted, they at least ought to have the opportunity to make their case on the floor where they've got specific concerns. And I think it's a tremendous overreach not to allow them to voice the concerns of their constituents and not to allow us to have the special knowledge they have of their own districts and their own concerns. So that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back.
Thank you. And I just would like to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record kind of the legislative history surrounding this legislation. In the last Congress, there were multiple markups. I just point out for the record. Mr. Gett, did you want to respond at all?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just going to point out in the last Congress, there were multiple hearings and multiple markups on all of these bills. And I believe all of these bills passed the House last year on a bipartisan basis. At least I know the PAW Act passed the House twice on a bipartisan basis, and it is the same bill as the last Congress.
Well, with all due respect to that argument, since it was my question, if I might respond, you know, number one, this isn't the last Congress. It doesn't have the same partisan balance as the last Congress, and frankly, it has 60 new members. Those members also ought to have an opportunity to participate. If it didn't make it through the last Congress, it ought to go back to go, like most legislation does, and work its way through. And if it's got all the merits that folks claim, then the result will be the same. It'll still pass the House, but those members deserve to have an opportunity to have their voices heard as well. And that just didn't in this case. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Torres.
I have no comments, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I guess the question I would ask Mr. Westerman is, that was a pretty impressive list that you ran through. I don't recall having ever received testimony from either majority or minority chairman or ranking member of a committee that went through such detail as to problems that members had. Presume some of them on your committee. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. You know, the fact that we're, again, putting these bills on the floor without having the committee process, there was a lot of objection by members. This is huge. I know there's a big $1.9 trillion bill going through Congress this week that's probably going to garner most of the headlines. But when you think about the amount of land that's being locked up, the implications to national security, the implications for our supply chain, when last year or in 2019, the U.S. only produced 0.5% of the uranium that's needed for our energy needs. People say, well, you know, that's being supplied to us from Canada and Australia, but Canada and Australia is being forced out by these state-run mining companies. And we're seeing the amount of uranium coming into the country from our allies decreasing as well. So there's major implications associated with this so-called land package. And you know, I'm not going to rehash everything again, but I promise you there's a lot of concern on our side of the dais that hasn't been addressed.
Well, I can't disagree with you. And again, I just don't know that I've ever heard a recitation from, again, either a chairman or ranking member of the problems that you went through by listing all of the amendments that have been filed to this bill. And Chairman McGovern, I recognize that you all have got till April 1st. You don't have to follow regular order. But I'm just reminded of the words of Tom DeLay when he was the majority leader. In times of trouble, regular order can be your friend. So I would make that recommendation to you, and also recommend that this bill be defeated and sent back to the committee and allow them to do their good work. So I thank you, and I'll yield back.
Yeah, thank you very much. And since my name was invoked again in McGovern rule, I just would say that I think it's a pretty sound rule, and because of the pandemic and the time to get things organized, we've given it until April 1st. But I remind the gentleman that when they were in charge, they had no such rule. And I'm happy to go through a recitation of all the legislation that was brought before the Rules Committee that never got a hearing or never was marked up in committee, major pieces of legislation. I now yield to Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And by my count, this is the third time we've heard this bill within the last year. And I would say, I'd ask my friend, Ms. Daggett, how long have you been working on this public lands legislation?
Mr. Perlmutter, the first time I introduced this bill was in 1999. So that's over 20 years ago. The bill was brought to me. So the areas in the Colorado portion of the bill were designated as wilderness study areas in the 1980s. They're primarily all low-lying BLM canyon country wilderness study areas. And they've been managed as wilderness for the last almost 40 years. A group of community activists tried to survey the remaining wild areas in Colorado, and they brought me the bill in 1999. I've been working on the bill since then. What that means is I've been going out to the communities in the affected areas, meeting with the citizens, the local elected officials, the county commissioners, hundreds of businesses, the outdoor recreation industry. And I've also personally toured many of these areas myself. Some of our colleagues, Mr. Landborne came on one of the trips with me, and others have come on these trips to look at these wilderness areas. And we use approved methods. So, you know, there's a lot of ways you can get into these areas. You can hike, you can horseback ride, you can raft, you can do a number of things. And also recreation opportunities. You can hunt, you can fish, you can do all sorts of things. So we've done all of that. And it's been for over 20 years we've been doing that.
All right, so let me guide you here a little bit. So in that time, again, by my count, there have been at least 4 or maybe 5 other members of Congress that have represented the area that you've been touring on horseback and by hiking and everything else. Because Mr. Cole challenged us, or challenged you, is like the person who represents that district knows best what's going on in that district. I would challenge that assumption or presumption by him that you've been working on this a long time. You've been basically over all of that ground. And in that period of time, there have been several different members of Congress. Am I mistaken?
No, and I will point out to you, Mr. Land, I've always consistently invited the other members of Congress. And as I also said, Mr. Landborne took me up on it and came on one of the wilderness tours. But of those other people you mentioned, none of the rest of them ever did.
And I guess I would also say that probably second only to getting the COVID package passed, public lands is sort of a #1 issue for Coloradans, is it not?
Oh, yes. It's 80%. There was a recent survey done at Colorado College. They do it every year. 80% said that they think it's a top priority to preserve more public land. 80%.
So I would just respond to Mr. Cole and to Mr. Westerman, who make legitimate arguments that this has been going on for 20 years, that Congresswoman DeGette, Senator Udall, Senator Bennett, Congressman Salazar, all have been involved in an effort to preserve these public lands. And at some point, you quit twiddling your thumbs and you move forward on something that's so important to the people of our state. And I thank the gentlewoman for pressing on with this public lands legislation. It is very important to us, and I yield back.
Mr. Palmer, can I just say one thing? Is the description I give for the Colorado lands, the same processes have been in place for all of the other land that is included in this bill.
Okay, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. My questions are directed at Ranking Member Westerman. Ranking Member Westerman, can you just do me a favor and elaborate on the Grand Canyon Protection Act, and specifically how that will impact uranium development and how that will impact any national security issues and implications?
Well, I think that goes to into the bigger discussion about, some of these bills have been passed before, passed on a bipartisan basis, but here we've got wilderness area designations lumped in with mineral withdrawals. And when we look at, the big picture on what's going on at the Grand Canyon, there's already a protected buffer around the Grand Canyon with the Grand Canyon National Park. There's no mining in the Grand Canyon. There never has been, and nobody desires to mine within the Grand Canyon National Park. We're talking about borders that are miles away from the Colorado River. These are lands where these uranium deposits are. A lot of these are state lands that would be used to fund schools and emergency services. And by imposing this wilderness designation, to understand the magnitude of it, this goes from the Grand Canyon all the way up right to the Utah border. We're talking about 40 to 50 miles of area that's going to be taken out and put into wilderness area. Back in 1984, there was an agreement between the Utah and Arizona delegations, and there was a wilderness designation that was put in place. There were several environmental groups involved in this, and there was a land area set aside for mineral exploration. And again, it's got federal lands, state lands, and some private land in it. And that's the problem with these kinds of bills, is you just go in and it's never enough. You can't just quote preserve wilderness. We see what's happening to wilderness areas all across this country, where 7 million acres of them went up in forest fires because we've taken land and taken any kind of scientific management off of that land and said we're going to let nature run its course, which is a form of management. But don't be mistaken to thinking that nothing's going to happen to this land. Those trees are going to continue to grow. You're going to get a catastrophic event like a man-made or lightning-caused wildfire, and something that you want to preserve is going to change very drastically when it goes up in smoke. And we can be good conservationists. We can go in and manage this land properly. We can extract minerals from it. We can negate the catastrophic impact of wildfire. We can use fire as our friend to keep these lands healthy and safe. But just saying we're going to draw a border around it, call it a wilderness area, and it's going to be hunky-dory from there on out is not any way to be good stewards of what we have. And there's several problems with designating this Grand Canyon area as off limits, any kind of mineral extraction. Nobody wants to mine inside the Grand Canyon. Nobody wants to destroy our public lands. Republicans, Democrats, and independents alike take great pride in the federal lands that we have. All we're asking is for some common sense, scientific approaches to managing it, not just trying to lock it up and throw away the key forever.
So, Ranking Member Westerman, just to summarize and paraphrase, you're basically saying that uranium mining is really not a threat to the Grand Canyon. And additionally, this act is not needed to protect the Grand Canyon. Is that a fair summation of what you said?
Absolutely, and there's been studies that solidify that. There's been mining going on there, and there's been analysis done. There's actually more uranium leaching into the Grand Canyon through the Basea pipes where these deposits are found than what a mine would ever cause. And again, we're talking about miles away from the canyon. I think there's this misnomer that people visualize a mining company working on the wall of the Grand Canyon, and that's the furthest thing from the truth. There's already a protective border and boundary around the canyon. This is going outside of that border and going many miles away from there. Really, it's just going to devastate the economy and do little for the environment.
That's right, Ranking Member Westerman. And can I just ask you to put yourself on mute for the next question? Thanks, Bruce. I appreciate it. Ranking Member Westerman, as you talked about regarding rare earth elements and our reliance on China and Russia, I just want to talk about that for a second. Our nation is currently reliant on China for rare earth elements and other minerals that are components, frankly, that are needed for everything from jet planes to cell phones. This is obviously a significant economic and national security threat, as China could very easily just cut off our supply of rare earth elements. And that's not a stretch of the imagination. We know that China has done this to sister democracies such as Japan, for instance. So with that said, Ranking Member Westerman, would H.R. 803 impact our ability to domestically produce critical minerals and thereby empowering China? And if so, what can we do to ensure that we don't tie our hands on rare earth and critical mineral development in these areas? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. You're absolutely right. Taking the largest deposits or known deposits of uranium in our country off of the market will make us even that much more reliable on foreign suppliers. And like I said, in 2019, 0.5%. That's how much domestic uranium we produced when we could be producing all of our uranium. I mentioned earlier the argument about Canada and Australia supplying uranium. Well, that number is going down too. It's down to 39%. It was 42% in 2018 and over 50% in 2017. But now our suppliers are Russia, Uzbekistan, China, and China's got these mines in Namibia. A lot of times, they have no environmental regulations, and they can't extract these materials nearly as well as we can. And we're talking about a green economy that's going to be more and more dependent on rare earth minerals, critical minerals, and we are blessed with those, and we should be utilizing them here in this country to create American jobs, to create cleaner power, and to do it with our resources and our people instead of farming that overseas and importing it more and more and more. And it's not, you can look through the list of critical minerals and other elements and minerals as well. And China and other countries who are not our friends on the supply chain are dominating those markets. And it doesn't have to be that way. We can develop these resources very environmentally friendly. We can be good stewards of the land. We can protect the Grand Canyon, and we can protect other areas when we extract these resources.
Thank you, Ranking Member Westerman. I appreciate it. With that, I yield back to the chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got no further questions on this.
Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ranking Member Westerman, I'm concerned that this bill would strip away important resource-based jobs that the lands provide. And in my home state, for example, my friend and colleague, Mr. Stauber, has talked about forestry and logging, and they remain a vital part of Minnesota's economy, providing hundreds of thousands of direct and spin-off jobs. Mr. Cole did ask about members and local communities and stakeholders having input, but I'm just kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and where do these types of good paying jobs go when the land in question is locked away?
Well, the first place I think these jobs go to is the private sector on private lands. But when you don't have all the resources you need on private lands, those jobs go to foreign countries. And the sad part is we could develop rural economies. We could utilize these resources in a sustainable way. There's nothing more sustainable and more environmentally friendly than a healthy forest. And we can manage those forests, pull these resources off, and make products like mass timber buildings that actually become carbon sinks. There's a lot of research going on biochar to increase the carbon absorbing content of our farmland. But we need these timber resources to make that happen. I talked about all of the elements and minerals that are needed for green economy. And we can, again, extract those in a more environmentally favorable way than anybody else in the world. And we can do that creating American jobs and rural economies. But instead, it looks like we're going to just continue locking up these resources and depending on other countries who aren't our friends, who are polluting. And it's a little bit hypocritical to say we want all of this new technology, but we're not going to use our resources to develop it. That it's not going to be in our backyard. It'll be in somebody else's backyard in some other part of the world that we'll likely never see.
And thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon.
I have no questions. Thank you.
Mr. Morelli.
No questions, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Ross.
No questions, Mr. Chairman.
Does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question? Seeing none, I would like to thank our witnesses for their testimony. You are now excused.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. I would now like to welcome our next panel, Representative Boebert of Colorado, Representative Stauber of Minnesota, Representative Plaskett of the Virgin Islands, Dr. Burgess and Dr. Burgess. So we'll begin with Ms. Boberg. Unmute. Yeah.
I apologize. I thought I did that. Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The bill we are discussing proposes to add nearly 1.5 million acres of new wilderness and permanently withdraws 1.2 million acres from mineral production. Approximately 550,000 of those 1.5 million acres that would be locked up by these new wilderness designations are in my district. A wilderness area designation is the most restrictive land use designation possible. It prevents things like bicycling and actively managing our forests to prevent catastrophic wildfires. Mr. Chairman, more than 55% of Colorado's 3rd district is federal land. In Colorado, access to federal land is vital to protect the livelihoods of local economies and ensure Americans can get out and enjoy our public lands. After the past year of statewide lockdowns, the last thing communities in my district need is further restrictions imposed by government limiting what they can do on public lands. People in my communities impacted by this lands package have raised significant concerns ranging from the loss of recreation, the elimination of multiple use of the land, and the overall threat to local rural economies. However, one of my biggest concerns in these Western states is the increased threat of disastrous wildfires that will result from the new wilderness designation and other land grabs in this bill. Colorado just came out of one of the worst wildfire seasons we've ever seen in decades. In 2020, the US set a new record for the number of acres burned by wildfires, as more than 10.3 million acres went up in smoke. Further restricting active forest management across federal land in multiple states should be a significant concern for everyone, especially when the states primarily affected in these bills rank in the top 10 nationally for severe wildfire threat. This collection of bills also adds massive new management burdens to federal agencies when what we need is better management of the lands they already own. Additionally, those same land management agencies have already testified in front of Congress that much of the proposed arbitrary changes in these bills are not suitable for these overly restricted designations. To declare massive swaths of land wilderness that do not possess those characteristics undermines the integrity of the lands that actually possesses those features. Mr. Chairman, the sponsor of Title I in this bill doesn't have a single acre designated as new wilderness in her bill for her district. Yet in Title I alone would lock up 510,000 acres in my district, 510,000 acres in my district, and specifically lists Dolores County multiple times when the local elected officials and wilderness experts there have not been sought for consultation by my Colorado colleague. This bill is being rushed through with no committee hearing, no committee markup, no witness testimony, outdated maps, and legal descriptions, and in some cases, no maps. In fact, page 289 of this bill says that we have to pass this bill to get a map, legal description, and find out what's in that title. Public land decisions should be made with local collaboration and input, or at the very least, the input of the member who represents the affected districts and states. Despite over 500,000 acres in my district being targeted and being the representative for the area that will be most impacted by this bill, I was not consulted or allowed to provide input on the bill. I know I'm new, but the people elected me to represent them in Washington, D.C., and that's exactly what I will do. I have submitted a number of amendments that I hope are made in order here today. These thoughtful amendments focus on allowing access and mitigation harm from land grabs in this bill that target my district. My proposed amendments would protect the jobs of Native Americans, women's, and minority groups who will be negatively impacted should this bill proceed as proposed. My proposed amendments also protect local grazing rights, water rights, access to our public lands, and ensure we can take action in our forests to prevent catastrophic wildfires. Perhaps most importantly, my amendments provide the people of my district a voice, ensuring local stakeholders have a seat at the table when land use is changed in their respective communities. After talking with a number of stakeholders, local officials, and people in my district over the last 2 weeks, and many more, they will be impacted by this bill. I was elected to Congress because the people in my district felt underrepresented. They are tired of having their voices drowned out by elected officials in Denver. I'm confident that my proposed changes are what's best for Colorado and the American people. I ask you to reconsider reaching into my district and taking the land from the people that I represent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And with that, I yield back the rest of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stauber, you need to turn on your video. All right, well,
Hello?
yeah, okay. Where are you? Okay. Mr. Stauber, you can testify now. I think you've disappeared again.
We'll come back.
Why don't we come back to Mr. Stauber? We're going to go to Ms. Plaskett, and then we'll come back to Mr. Stauber.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the members, Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole. Thank you for the opportunity to present my perspective on my amendment number 57 to the Protecting America's Wilderness and Public Land Act, H.R. 830. My amendment would designate a National Heritage Area site for the island of St. Croix in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The efforts for this designation have been preceded by nearly 20 years of hard work on the part of many individuals, community groups, and local stakeholders in my district. This National Heritage designation is being proposed pursuant to a congressionally directed feasibility study that was completed by the National Park Service more than 10 years ago in September of 2010. The study was initiated by the National Park Service after it was included in the National Heritage Areas Act of 2006 by my predecessor, Dr. Donna Christensen. According to the National Park Service, National Heritage Areas are places that are federally designated to preserve an important aspect of America's past and share it with visitors. They are generally started at the grassroots level by community members. They are not living theme parks seeking to freeze places in time, but seek to instead to conserve their special natural spaces and historic places as part of their community's social and economic future. The successful melding of past and future is the National Heritage Area Challenge. The unique natural, historic, and cultural resources of St. Croix represent distinctive aspects of the heritage of America that have been determined by the National Park Service to be worthy of recognition and provide outstanding recreational and educational opportunities. St. Croix is where Columbus first arrived in the Virgin Islands on his second voyage to the New World in 1493, and is the only place where he physically landed in the United States. It is also home of the first Secretary of the Treasurer and drafter of our Constitution, Alexander Hamilton. Today, the island has two distinct towns, Christiansted, built in 1734, and Frederiksted, built in 1752. Christiansted is the one-time Danish West Indies capital and is now a National Historic Site. Just off the coast of Christiansted is Buck Island, the only U.S. underwater national monument. Frederiksted on the island of St. Croix is known for its shoreline and deep ports and is the site of the successful slave insurrection that led to the emancipation from chattel slavery in 1848. It is one of only two places in the Western Hemisphere where slaves were able to take their freedom. After nearly 4 years of community engagement and examination of the merits of the National Heritage Area designation by the National Park Service, the NPS feasibility study team concluded that the island of St. Croix meets the evaluation criteria for designation as a national heritage area based on the applicable National Heritage Area feasibility study guidelines. As described throughout the study, St. Croix has contributed in substantial ways to our American national heritage. It also contains an assemblage of natural, cultural, historic, and scenic resources that make up a nationally distinctive landscape. The rich and varied stories about St. Croix lend themselves to an intriguing set of themes that connect people to the various heritage resources of the island. Furthermore, the designation of St. Croix as a national heritage area has strong support from the public and from community stakeholders, and there is a local capacity and commitment to undertake the responsibility of initiating a national heritage area. Therefore, my amendment will complete this work in a way that is consistent with the procedural traditionally set forth for such a heritage area designation as last enacted by John D. Dingell Jr. Conservation Management and Recreational Act of 2019. The amendment would require coordinating entities to submit the management plan to the Department of Interior within 3 years of enactment, and that the department approve or deny the management within 180 days of receiving it. It would further require the Secretary of Interior to submit a report on activities in the heritage area to Congress no later than 3 years before the federal funding authority for the area would expire. Federal funding for the area would expire after 15 years unless renewed, and the federal cost share of any heritage activity could not exceed the standard 50%. Heritage areas represent a collaborative, community-based preservation strategy to identify and preserve historic resources that represent the heritage of our nation. Through this amendment, I seek to finish the long-standing work of my home island to utilize our spectacular natural and historic resources to spur economic development that is badly needed. I ask that you please approve my amendment number 57. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And now I will go back to Mr. Stauber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole, thank you for the opportunity to testify today in support of the several amendments I submitted to H.R. 803, a bill to further expand government control of our natural resources. H.R. 803 contains 8 different bills, none of which were marked up in the House Natural Resources Committee this Congress, despite all being in the committee's jurisdiction. All 8 restrict access to land or limit responsible development of America's natural resources. One of the bills, the so-called Grand Canyon Protection Act, actually has nothing to do with the Grand Canyon, but instead arbitrarily destroys the uranium industry in the state. In fact, it would end access to one of America's largest uranium sources at a time when, according to the Energy Information Administration, we are 93% import reliant for our uranium. Also, according to the EIA, 3 of the leading countries we import uranium from are Kazakhstan, Russia, and Uzbekistan. Chairman McGovern, none of these countries have a strong record on human rights. And for that reason, my amendment number 8 will require the Secretary of the Interior to consult with the Secretaries of Labor and Commerce to ensure the United States does not currently import uranium sourced or processed by child or slave labor before this bill takes effect. This is a common sense measure that has received significant bipartisan support in the past. Mr. Chair, last Congress, 16 Democrats voted in favor of a similar amendment in the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. After receiving a total of 43 votes to add the amendment to H.R. 2, the Rules Committee stripped it out in a manager's package, denying our committee the opportunity to send legislation to the floor it duly marked up. Therefore, Mr. Chair, I respectfully ask that you make this amendment in order so we can finally add some common sense protections against child and slave labor internationally. Mr. Chair, on the President's first day in office, he laid off nearly 1,000 laborers by revoking a permit for Keystone XL alone, according to news sources. Then the president put in place bans on oil and gas development on federal lands, leading to even further job loss. And my amendment number 9 is common sense legislation owed to workers hurt by these Biden bans. It creates the Energy and Mineral Worker Assistance Fund, which will provide needed financial assistance to employees displaced or laid off because the president chose far left, anti-jobs, activist groups over union workers. The folks laid off had quality, high-wage jobs. They were able to support families, and they take pride in their work. It has been 34 days since President Biden killed these jobs, and no replacement jobs have materialized. So let's help these folks out. The last 3 amendments, 10, 11, and 12, restored local control to these federal land grabs. Number 10 requires approval from local counties before any of the many mineral withdrawals or federal land control expansions take effect. Many counties oppose federal legislation that will kill jobs in their hometowns and further their reliance on PILT. Amendments 11 and 12 disallow any withdrawals or wilderness expansions from taking place in Colorado's 3rd and 5th districts or Arizona's 4th district. My friends and colleagues, Representative Boebert, Landborne, and Gosar, all oppose this underlying legislation because their districts overwhelmingly oppose it. They were not meaningfully consulted when these bills were drafted and have opposed them every step of this way. You know, Mr. Chair, let's listen to all members that represent these areas and the local officials that govern them. Lastly, Mr. Chair, I stand in support of the amendment I co-sponsored with my colleague and neighbor, Representative Tiffany, and my colleague, Representative Golden. Our amendment uses bipartisan language to bring the EPA's definition of slash and pre-commercial thinnings in line with the Forest Service, state forestry agencies, and common sense, so we can continue robust forest management. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. And now the last member of this panel, Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Amendment number 22 to H.R. 803 states that this act shall not be effective until the Secretary of the Interior issue a report that Section 802 of the bill, the withdrawal of certain federal lands of the state of Arizona, will not increase mineral imports from Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Namibia. Section 802 would permanently ban any mineral development on more than 1 million acres of federal land in Arizona. In recent years, America has become dependent on foreign and state-backed entities to provide critical minerals, particularly uranium. So it's no secret these foreign producers do have questionable human rights records. There is a history of labor and environmental abuses. As currently written, this legislation could only increase our dependence on these foreign producers. Uranium fuels our nation's nuclear power technologies. It is an important emissions-free baseload power source. It is, of course, by definition, low carbon. To ensure that we can produce this fuel domestically, we must continue its development and our energy independence by limiting foreign imports. So I urge colleagues to support this amendment. I urge the committee to make it in order, and I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cole, any questions?
A couple. First of all, Mr. Chairman, I'd urge that all the amendments that we've heard be made in order. It's interesting to me, we've had one member that wants additional land designated in certain status, and I support that, certainly support making the amendment in order, and would support it because I think the member knows her district, obviously better than any of the rest of us do, and the effort that's gone into it. We have another member who said, no matter how well intentioned, somebody shouldn't be able to come into my district and designate a 500,000 acres plus as wilderness over my objection. And just for the record, her predecessor also objected to this. So I just think those are, I mean, that's astonishing to me that we're at the point that we're basically disregarding what members think about their own district. It's one thing when we're talking about national legislation, we all have different opinion, it affects the entire country, but to not give special consideration where members are speaking for local constituencies that we are going to impact disproportionately, no matter how well intentioned the other member is, when nothing in their district is being impacted. That just astonishes me. I don't care how often you travel to the district, you don't know it as well as the people that live in the district and the people that represent the district. And however well-intentioned your idea is, you shouldn't be able to impose your point of view on to that kind of degree, in a very concentrated way. So I think we should go back to when we really listen when we're taking this amount of land out of productive use and not listen to local voices. So it concerns me a great deal. But I would just urge that all these amendments be made in order, that all these members, none of whom had an opportunity before the Committee of Jurisdiction to make their case, at least have an opportunity on the floor to voice their concerns about what's happening in their own districts. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Torres.
I have no comments, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Burgess?
Well, I certainly want to thank everyone who's brought very thoughtful amendments. Serving with Representative Boebert on the Budget Committee, I've been impressed with her ability to. She's a very short time here in the House of Representatives, but she seems to have grasped a rather complex set of issues completely. And I think, as Mr. Cole just said, she should be listened to when the bulk of the land in her district is going to be affected by this. It is important that her amendment be made in order. And of course, Mr. Chairman, I don't have to tell you my amendment number 22. There's no question that it should be made in order, and look forward to the committee making that case. So I'll yield back.
Mr. Perlmutter?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And ordinarily, I would agree with Ms. Boebert and with Mr. Cole, except that this acreage has been on the table for at least the 15 years that I've been in Congress. This is not a new issue. This isn't something that's a surprise. And I just, the polling statewide, and my guess is the polling in that fifth, are supportive of preserving the public lands that exist. And so there are two pieces of legislation. One is from Mr. Gett, one is from Mr. Naguse that play here. And I understand the ire that my colleague may have, and I understand the statements that Mr. Cole has made, but this has been an issue for, as I said, 15 years. We heard this bill 3 times last year alone. So with that, I yield back.
Mr. Perlmutter, I think Ms. Boebert had her hand up.
Oh, sure. I'd yield to Ms. Boebert.
I appreciate that, Representative Perlmutter, and thank you so much for trying to understand where we're coming from here. But this has been an issue for a very long time, and it's been an issue that my district has been very concerned with for a very long time. I have met with county commissioners on multiple times throughout my campaign, and now as their representative. And they've expressed the amount of letters that they've sent in to Representative DeGette and begged her to please not mess with their land. I believe that my election shows the polling in my district. They understand that I was there to advocate for multi-use on federal lands, and I would not allow.
Let me reclaim my time. Let me reclaim my time so we can. But Ms. DeGette also has numerous letters from other commissioners, because we had this testimony in this debate with Mr. Tipton probably 2 times last year, where both of them were bringing in all sorts of letters from all sorts of commissioners who want to see either, some of them don't want to see it preserved, and others want to see all of this preserved. So it isn't, universal one way or the other. So to that point, you're right. But having listened to this debate for all these years now, I guess I come down otherwise. I certainly would appreciate you and Mr. Gett having the opportunity to speak to each other about all of this and see if there isn't some common area. But at this point, for me, knowing how much the people in my district appreciate the public lands in your district, I just am going to support this bill again, as I have in the past. But I appreciate your testimony, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Rushenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Boebert, I believe you were speaking and time was reclaimed. Was there anything you'd like to add that you didn't get a chance to?
I would just like to express the will of the voters in my district. My election is a testimony of what the voters are asking for there in the district, and they want the land for the people. It's the people's land, and to close that off, to eliminate forest mitigation, so we can actually maintain our forests and prevent these wildfires. That's very important to us here. In my district, I had to drive hours around wildfires last year to campaign, and my district burnt up heavily because we aren't able to actively manage our forests. And so I would like the opportunity to speak with Representative DeGette about this. Unfortunately, it didn't come through the House Committee on Natural Resources, so I could have that conversation there and offer amendments there. And so I would just like my amendments to be considered and made in order through this hearing, since this is my only shot at protecting the lands truly for the people in my district. And with that, I yield back to you, Mr. Rushenthaler. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mrs. Boebert. I appreciate it. With that, I would like just to associate myself with the comments made by our ranking member, Cole. And with that, I would yield back to the chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's see, I just wanted to make 2 points. One is about the language of land grab. As I understand HR 803, its purpose is to preserve the land of the people for the people so that it will bolster the outdoor recreation economies of Colorado and California and Washington and Arizona. It will preserve the extraordinary pristine wildlife habitats that are out there. And it will support access to clean water, all while reducing the nefarious effects of climate change, which we see in the out of control forest fires and the destruction of entire ecosystems and the drought and the flooding. And now what we've seen in Texas, some people are in complete denial about climate change and the effect that it's having on the environment. So when I think about land grabs, I think about the people that want to use land for their own selfish purposes, to make money for themselves, and then to leave wreckage for everybody else. So I would think that land grab doesn't capture what's going on in this bill. On the contrary, now I understand there can be honest differences about that. Some people want just to turn land over to uranium mining or whatever it might be, and don't want to keep the land for the people. But I think phrasing this in terms of local home rule or control just strikes me as kind of bizarre. I mean, I have in my district NIH and NOAA and the Food and Drug Administration. Do I have veto power over anything that anybody else in the country wants to do relating to the FDA or the NIH or NOAA and their budgets? I mean, that just strikes me as bizarre. The whole point of having a United States Congress and the Supremacy Clause is that Congress governs, and this is not a question up to local county commissioners or city councils or town councils. So with that, I will, I support the legislation strongly because I think it promotes a tremendous national public program. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Fishbach.
And Mr. Chair, I would just like to support the comments of Ranking Member Cole and just make sure that all of these amendments are made in order, because it really is this is something the members should be able to represent their constituents and make their case to the full body. And so I would ask that these amendments be made in order. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Were you trying to get my attention earlier? To stop?
Yes, I was.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair McGovern. I appreciate this opportunity. My colleague, Mr. Raskin, had talked about the land use and whatever. I want to just give you a historical perspective of something that happened in our great state of Minnesota. In 1978, the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness was established, and the buffer zone around the wilderness was established. And at that time, our congressional giant, James Oberstar, said, okay, if you're going to put this wilderness around the Boundary Waters Canoe Area and the buffer zone, that's fine, but do not take our livelihood away. And Congressman Oberstar back then was talking about the timber harvesting and the mining. And guess what? 43 years later, we are trying to mine copper nickel in the biggest copper nickel find in the world. And we're fighting to be able to get into that. So that agreement in 1978 is not allowing us to move forward in a responsible way, allowing the process to move forward. So when my colleague, Mr. Raskin, when I say land grab, I'm giving you an absolute true example of what happened in northern Minnesota. And by the way, if we want alternative sources of energy, the Duluth complex has 88% of the reserves this nation needs to transfer or go towards electric vehicles and alternative sources of energy. So if you want to use northern Minnesota as an example of what can happen when these wilderness areas are designated without allowing other opportunities outside there. That's why in my comments, Mr. Chair, I said they're not going to mine in the Grand Canyon. We will never allow that. We are environmentalists. We can do both.
Thank you.
Pristine, clean environment and create great paying jobs. It's called paycheck justice.
Thank you.
And I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Scanlon.
I have no questions. Thank you.
Mr. Morelli.
I have many questions, but in the interest of time, I'll just ponder them in my own mind. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Ross.
I have no further questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Plaskett, I should tell you that Congresswoman DeGette invited the entire Rules Committee to come to tour the wilderness areas in Colorado.
My district.
Yeah, it might be nice for you to come and invite us to come.
I would love to have the entire Rules Committee come to the Virgin Islands.
Okay.
We can start by visiting St. Croix for the National Heritage Area,
Sure.
Go over to Buck Island, and then of course we would round it out on the island of St. John, which is 70% national park, where you would have to look at the underground reef and do some coral diving as well.
Well, I'll talk to the ranking member, Mr. Cole, about maybe a bipartisan.
I can agree right now, Mr. Chairman.
See, I've created a bipartisan agreement.
Chairman McGovern, hey, Burgess here.
Yes.
I do need to point out to you that the Energy and Commerce Committee has already made a trip to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And of course, it was under a little bit different circumstances, but I think the bipartisan nature of the offer is one that ought to be entertained.
Well, we will follow up. Does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question? Seeing none, I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony. You're now excused.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there any other members who wish to testify in HR 803? Seeing none, this closes the hearing on HR 803. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant HR 803, the Protecting America's Wilderness and Public Lands Act, a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Natural Resources. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 117-2, modified by the amendment printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides that following debate, each further amendment printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report, not earlier considered as part of amendments on block pursuant to Section 3, shall be considered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, may be withdrawn by the proponent at any time before the question is put thereon, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule provides that at any time after debate, the chair of the Committee on Natural Resources or his designee may offer amendments on block consisting of further amendments printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report not earlier disposed of. Amendments on block shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for 20 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Natural Resources or their designees, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in the Rules Committee report or amendments on block described in Section 3 of the resolution. The rule provides one motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of Hr5, the Equality Act, under a closed rule. The rule provides 90 minutes of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the bill should be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit, and I yield back.
You heard the motion from the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Is there any amendment or discussion? Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my first amendment, and I'll have two,
Okay.
actually deals with something that we didn't discuss in the hearing, so forgive me for the rather lengthy discussion, but I'm told it's in order to offer this amendment on this legislation. I move that the committee add language to the resolution that would eliminate the tolling of days for the consensus calendar, the War Powers Act, and for resolutions of inquiry. Mr. Chairman, I understand that we're in the midst of a pandemic and that these legislative restrictions made sense as the House sought to react as to how to do business during a public health emergency. But Mr. Chairman, these provisions were initially put in place on May 18, 2020, 280 days ago. Since then, all committees have demonstrated their ability to hold hearings and markups virtually since then, and therefore these provisions are no longer necessary. And I actually thank you, Mr. Chairman. You have a big role in demonstrating the possibility of doing this. Instead, I'm concerned that the majority continues to keep these provisions in place to avoid having to address some of the real concerns members on both sides have. In the 115th Congress, 18 properly drafted resolutions of inquiry were authored by Democrats and considered by their committee of jurisdiction. We're only asking that the same treatment be accorded now. Similarly, Mr. Chairman, you've previously been highlighted, and you have, the creation of the consensus calendar in the last Congress. Yet because of our current restrictions, it's impossible to even place any legislation on the consensus calendar. With the majority leader's renaming of our typical recess periods as, quote, committee work weeks, it's clear committees can continue to do their work. In fact, in the past 2 weeks, committees have been able to mark up almost $2 trillion reconciliation package. If committees are able to handle this significant workload, they should be able to handle resolutions of inquiries, War Powers Act resolutions, and mark up legislation that enjoys significant bipartisan support. Absent the willingness of committees to actually do their jobs, the recourse available to the House should actually be available. So I urge the adoption of my motion, and I yield back.
Thank you, and I appreciate the gentleman's amendment, and I'm not totally unsympathetic with the gentleman's amendment. But these are extraordinary times that we're living in, and these restrictions will not be in place forever. I think the hope was to keep them in through the pandemic, because obviously we're limiting what we're doing on the floor. I mean, even the way we operate is different from the way we operated when there wasn't a pandemic. I mean, we're voting amendments on block and things like that. I mean, so I appreciate the gentleman's amendment. And let me urge my colleagues. I'm urging my colleagues to vote no on it. But I take the gentleman's concerns seriously.
May I just quickly respond, Mr. Chairman?
Absolutely.
First of all, thank you very much for that. And I know it's sincere, because I know many of these things you're concerned about too as an institutionalist. Certainly you are about the consent calendar, certainly you are about War Powers Act. You've demonstrated those sorts of things throughout your career. So while I'll ask for the vote, I very much take you at your word. I know this is not something, and frankly, we flagged this partly because we want to keep it in front of everybody, ourselves included, so that we don't slip into this habit indefinitely, because I do think, and I know this isn't the intention. I know we are responding to a pandemic, so please know that I take you at your word. But we've done better at this, honestly, than I thought we would, and I hope that the majority will look at this and think about this seriously, so that, because I think this gets down to the power of individual members. And it's been, in my view, the biggest problem of the pandemic, and it's not by design. I blame no one for this. This is just a consequence of the circumstances in which we find ourselves. But I find that individual members in this circumstance have a great deal less influence than they had prior to. I mean, power tends to then get concentrated at the leadership level on both sides. Again, this is not a partisan accusation. So I just think it's important for us as a body to be thinking about this, and frankly, to be reminding our leadership on both sides of the aisle, this isn't the way things normally would work. This isn't the way any of us would want things to work. So while we'll ask for the amendment, again, I respect very much the manner in which you treated it, and I know without any doubt at all that you've got the same ultimate goal, and we'll look forward to working with you that as we go forward. But I would ask for a vote on it. Well, I know we have to do the voice vote first.
Right, and I appreciate that. I mean, again, even though I want to urge a no vote, I appreciate the spirit in which the amendment was offered. So the vote is now on the amendment from the gentleman from Oklahoma. Is there any other discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the gentleman's amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the no.
Mr. Chairman, I thought we actually won that voice vote, but so.
I have a different hearing piece, yeah. Does the gentleman ask for a recorded vote?
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will please call the roll.
Mr. Hastings, Mrs. Torres,
No.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter,
No.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin,
No.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon,
No.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli,
I share the gentleman's concern, but I'm no on the motion.
Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier, Ms. Ross,
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Cole,
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess,
Aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler,
Aye.
Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach,
Yes.
Mrs. Fishbach, sorry, could you repeat that?
Yes.
Mrs.
Aye.
Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman,
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Are there other amendments? Mr. Cole?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have one other. I have an amendment to the rule, and I move that the committee provide an open rule on HR 803 and HR 5. And I do that for a number of reasons, Mr. Chairman. The first is neither of these bills have gone through the committee process. And this is a different Congress. It does have a different partisan balance of power, although my friends are still in the majority. And it certainly has a lot of new members that ought to have an opportunity to participate. Beyond that, I mean, I thought the testimony on the public lands bill, was just astonishing. there's a big difference, with all due respect to my friend, Mr. Raskin, the NIH, and talking about a landmass concentrated in a particular district. The NIH is a national institution, which, by the way, I've supported robustly, as my friend knows, for many years, and look forward to continuing to. It's one of the crown jewels we have. But I don't think that's the same as a member coming and asking us to put additional land in this protected status within her district. I support that. I think she knows, what she's talking about. And another one coming and saying, look, this is 500,000 acres in my 500,000 acres. And this is going to materially impact the people that live and work in my district. It's going to materially impact the safety of my district. Doesn't affect anybody else's district to near this degree. And so for that member to not have an opportunity even to raise the matter in committee, I think is different. And I think you have to give a lot of leeway to the person who actually represents it. With all due respect, you can point to all the polls you want. There's one person that actually speaks for the people that live in that district, and she's telling us this is a bad idea. And by the way, her predecessor, who she defeated us, told us exactly the same thing. So, it's very well-meaning. I mean, I have an interest in Mr. Perlmutter. I know has a beautiful district and a wonderful place, but I wouldn't presume to come in and say, I think I know what's better for 500,000 acres in your district than you do. This is something we need to really think about as members. And again, I have enormous respect for the author of the legislation, tremendous legislator. Worked with her very carefully and watched her and Fred Upton on 21st Century Cures. That's one thing. This is something that affects individual districts disproportionately and very differently. And I would hope at the minimum, we give Ms. Boebert an opportunity to make her case, and we give other affected members the opportunity to make their case on this. But it's a dangerous precedent. And I will tell you, it is much different than it was when I arrived here 19 years ago. I mean, I can't imagine, maybe we did, I don't know, maybe I just don't recall, but this is an extraordinary impact on a particular district. And the member of that district is vehemently opposed and has not had the opportunity to even voice the opposition, except in this committee, where it's 9-4 against her. And I suspect a lot of you, and I respect however you vote. That's and particularly on this committee, I generally can predict how all of us are going to vote. But I suspect every member, if they heard this testimony, would be concerned that that happen in my district? Could I be in the same circumstances? Can somebody from another district decide to this degree that they know what's better for the people I represent than I do? That's something we all ought to think about, because this isn't impacting national policy. This is not saying I'm trying to impact policy for every one of your constituents. This says I'm seeking for the people who sent me here, and with all due regard to anybody else, nobody from this district voted for any of you. And this is what my people are telling me. So I think it's not the only consideration, I grant you that, but it's an important consideration. And for all of these members in their respective districts to not have an opportunity to have made their case before the respective committee, they ought to at least get a chance to make it on the floor. They probably won't win, although, you never know, because I think a lot of members will listen to this and think, is that a good precedent for us to be setting? So with that, I would urge the adoption of an open rule for this, so all members could have the opportunity to make their case for their districts to all the other members in Congress. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. Let me just say that there are 3 bipartisan amendments in order on the lands bill, 14 Democratic amendments and 12 Republican amendments, so it's fairly even. On the Equality Act, it's even. Nobody got any amendments on the Equality Act, but let me just say about the precedent. I remember when Barney Frank was here, we both represented Fall River, and there was a vote on whether or not to force an LNG facility to be built right smack on the outskirts of the city. We fought hard against it. But I think almost everybody here who was there on the Republican side voted against what we wanted. And if you want to talk about interference in people's districts, let's have Eleanor Holmes Norton come before the Rules Committee and testify. How every aspect of the District of Columbia is micromanaged, including, social policy. So I appreciate it. But I would, again, urge my colleagues to vote no on the Justice Amendment.
Mr. Chairman, could I, thanks. And to Mr. Cole, I'd say, those are great sweeping statements that you've made. The trouble is, these are public lands, national forests, mountainous properties. That it's not like some flat land where we're going to go graze a bunch of cattle or something like that. This is something that has been in the eye of preservation for years, and the effort is just to finalize that. And so it isn't like it hasn't been without notice. It hasn't been without, an effort going on for years. And I mean, I said this during the testimony, this is not a surprise to anybody. It is of national interest, as Mr. Raskin said. I mean, some districts have NIH. Other districts have Mount Elbert. And they're both national treasures. And that's the way I think Coloradans look at it. And so I would just yield back. I oppose the gentleman's motion.
The vote now is on the Cole Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No.
No.
Continue the chair. The noes have it.
Chairman, on that, we request the yeas and nays.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings, Mrs. Torres,
No.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter,
No.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin,
No.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon,
No.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli,
No.
Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier, Ms. Ross,
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Cole,
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess,
Aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler,
Aye.
Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach,
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman,
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Is there further discussion or amendment?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Burgess.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule to make an order. Amendment number 22 to HR 803 offered by myself. It's an amendment that states this act shall not be effective until the Secretary of the Interior issues a report that Section 802 will not increase mineral imports from Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, or Namibia. And I ask the amendment be made in order.
You heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? If not, the vote is on the Burgess amendment. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, no. No.
No.
Continue the chair. The noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays have been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings, Mrs. Torres,
No.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter,
No.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin,
No.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon,
No.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli,
No.
Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier, Ms. Ross,
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Cole,
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess,
Aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler,
Aye.
Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach,
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman,
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Is there further amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment.
Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule to make an order amendment number 19 to HR 803, which was offered by Ms. Boebert. Now, Mr. Chairman, this amendment requires approval by affected counties for wilderness or potential wilderness designations in this act to take effect. Mr. Chairman, since this legislation before us today lacks the type of local consensus and balance that should be required for a bill of this scale, This common sense amendment ensures those affected by HR 803 have a chance for their voices to be heard. Local leaders and stakeholders have voiced significant concerns on the effect of this bill, and therefore it is imperative that their opinions are considered before there's any kind of implementation on this. Mr. Chairman, for this reason, I think it's vital that this amendment gets a full debate on the House floor, and I would urge my colleagues to adopt this motion. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
You heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion?
No.
The vote is on the Reschenthaler amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
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 Let's have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request yeas and nays, please.
The yeas and nays have been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings, Mrs. Torres,
No.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter,
No.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin,
No.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon,
No.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli,
No.
Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier, Ms. Ross,
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Cole,
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess,
Aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler,
Aye.
Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach,
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman,
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report the total.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Any other amendments for discussion?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment.
Ms. Fishbach.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment to the rule to make an order amendment number 3 to Hr5 offered by Mr. Subi of Florida. This amendment bans recipients of federal funds from permitting biological males from competing with biological women or girls. And I just wanted to take a moment to thank Congressman Subi for all of his work on this sensitive issue and how he approaches it with the best of intention. Yeah, Mr. Chair, Title IX was implemented to ensure that women have the same opportunities as men, including in sports, but the legislation before us today runs contrary to that. And for this reason, it's imperative that this amendment gets a full debate on the House floor, and I urge adoption of my motion.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think Mr. Cicilline responded to this pretty thoroughly in the hearing, but is there any other discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chair, I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays have been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings, Mrs. Torres,
No.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter,
No.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin,
No.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon,
No.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli,
No.
Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier, Ms. Ross,
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Cole,
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess,
Aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler,
Aye.
Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach,
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman,
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments? Hearing none, the vote now is on the motion from the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
On that, we would request the yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays have been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings, Mrs. Torres,
Aye.
Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter,
Aye.
Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin,
Aye.
Mr. Raskin, aye. Ms. Scanlon,
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli,
Aye.
Mr. Morelli, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier, Ms. Ross,
Aye.
Ms. Ross, aye. Mr. Cole,
No.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Burgess,
No.
Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Reschenthaler,
No.
Mr. Reschenthaler, no. Mrs. Fishbach,
No.
Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Chairman,
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk report the total.
7 yeas, 4 nays.
And the motion is agreed to. And Ms. Scanlon will carry it for the Democrats.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I have the exciting news to report that Mr. Reschenthaler will make his debut on the floor representing the Republican side tomorrow.
Well, I don't know whether he drew the short straw or whether, congratulations. So,
Any opportunity to debate a rule, Mr. Chairman, coming out of this committee is a great honor.
absolutely, absolutely. We'll all watch attentively tomorrow. No, there's no other business. So without objection, the committee is adjourned. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.